So I'm going to try to keep this pretty conversational, so definitely think of questions that you have to ask at the end so we can have a really great question and answer session. So as he said, my name is Jennifer Cooper, and I'm the Landscape Architecture Bureau Manager for the Department of Public Works in San Francisco. And so I'm going to tell you kind of the personal story of my professional journey, as 20 years in the landscape architecture profession. I'm going to break it up into kind of post-undergrad and post-grad school because it kind of fits neatly into decades, which sounds like a long time now. But so I'll try to break it up like that just so that you can kind of compare it to the journey that you're going through and kind of think of how your career might unfold down the road. And as far as finding your own projects, I really want to encourage you guys to think about where you want to go in landscape architecture and to not necessarily wait for the projects to find you, but to find the projects that you feel need to be done and then put together the teams and the communities and the funding to try to make those projects happen. So just not waiting, but really kind of taking charge of what needs to happen in landscape architecture. So just to start my story off, I went to undergraduate school at Clemson University. It was a 5-year professional degree. And it really was what I thought undergrad would be. It was green lawns and big old buildings and football games. And I have to say that I had a really great experience in the landscape architecture department. I had toured a lot of different schools, but Clemson just really seemed like it had that personal touch. It wasn't so big that you were just lost in the numbers. And all the teachers really took a lot of time and made sure to kind of share everything that they knew with us. And even after that, I'm still in touch with a lot of my old teachers from undergrad, and they still help me out today, and now I'm able to help them out. So my first job was in New York City, and one of my undergraduate professors, Lali Tai, who's now a professor at Temple University, said, if anyone ever wants to move to New York and go work for my old firm, let me know. So I was like, me? So she made an introduction to her firm, Hart-Howerton, and I moved from Clemson to New York, not really knowing anybody. I just kind of packed up what I could fit in my car and drove north. So it was a pretty exciting beginning to my landscape architecture adventure. But one thing I learned once I got there is really one of the best things you could do is to get involved. So I didn't know anybody in New York, but I was there for 10 years, and by the time I left, I felt like I knew everyone. Because right when I got there, I got in touch with the local landscape architecture chapter, and I said, are there any meetings I could come to? And so I said, yeah, come to this meeting. And I didn't realize it was actually the executive committee meeting, so they wrote me in right away. Pretty soon I was on the executive committee, I was organizing the holiday party, organizing events. People are always looking for new blood, that's energetic about getting things going in the chapter. So I was involved with ASLA the whole time I lived in New York and now in San Francisco. But eventually I was able to become the president of the group and speak and be on panels. And it was really kind of a launch pad for my own career. And I definitely find that those are still the people that helped me when I came out to San Francisco. It was actually New York contacts that were introducing me to San Francisco contacts. And now I get to do the same, introducing San Francisco people to my New York contacts. And so, I would never minimize kind of your network of your classmates, the people in ASLA, kind of the people you meet along the way, because that is really a network that is going to serve you for the rest of your career. So whether it's nonprofits, ASLA, local community groups, definitely just get involved. And so my first job was at Hart-Howerton, which does a lot of international kind of resort-based development. So it's like golf, ski, and beach, pretty much is kind of what it's centered around. But what I really liked about the firm was that it was interdisciplinary. So they did have urban planners, architects, landscape architects all working together in the same firm. And they were very regional about their work. So if they were doing a project in Vail, it looked like a project that belonged in Vail. So they used local materials, native plants, really tailored the architecture and the landscape architecture to where it was at. So I really appreciated that about the work. This was a private school that I worked on in Westlake, Texas. So I had to learn all my native Texas plants, but I was living in New York. And so kind of just having the flexibility to learn these new plant palettes. I was always on the phone with native plant growers from Texas who, if you've ever tried to call anyone who's involved with native plants, they're always the nicest people ever. They're just really excited that you also want to know about the thing that they love. So be careful if you get on the phone because you might be on the phone for an hour or so. But everybody was really helpful, and this was just a great place for me to land because it was a very family-feeling firm. Everybody was just really trying to mentor you, especially being the junior designer. But after a while, all our projects were in exotic locations that I could not go. So usually it was, the principal who was going to meet with the client in Vail or Bermuda or somewhere, and I was in the office, and I would get photos of the site, and then I would send out the drawings, and then I would get photos of it finished. So I just really felt like I wasn't understanding the scale of the sites and of the projects, and I wasn't learning from the construction detailing. So as much as I loved the work, I decided I really needed to work for a firm that was local. And so I found a local firm in New York called Neilson that did really only work in the 5 boroughs. So getting to be involved from start to finish on projects was really what I was looking for. And of course, it was through an ASLA contact that I got that introduction. And so just looking a little bit at this work, this was a women-owned firm, Neilson. I was there for 6 years. And I felt like this was really kind of the formative, like junior to middle part of my career, where I felt like I really understood how to build quality landscape projects. And I know sometimes we get impatient because we want everything to happen fast in our career. But when you're building projects, it takes time. So if you're involved in the design, that might be a year or so, and then you're building the project, and that's a couple of years. And so really there's a cycle of a few years for actually designing the thing, building the thing, learning from the project before you can apply it to the next one. So you're kind of always learning things as you go. So I would just, be patient with yourself, kind of once you're out in the field and you're actually tackling these projects in real life, is that, it'll take a few cycles of projects really for you to start to internalize all of those things that you're learning. You may recognize the Pepsi sign as you see it normally from the Manhattan side. This is in Long Island City, Queens. So Neilson did a great mix of kind of public and private work in the city. So this was some private developer work. We were doing a lot of new high-rises in Long Island City at that time. This was called Queens West 6 at the time. I'm sure it has a much nicer branded name now, but I always know it as Queens West 6. But this was a private park that was within the development, and we designed these custom seats as waves so that when you look at it from a distance, they kind of stack up like waves. But one of the things I took away from this project is that it takes a lot of hard detailing to make something look really simple. Like we wanted these to just kind of float over the paving just a bit, but to make things look like they're floating, it means you have to support them from the middle, but you don't want to see the supports, and so you kind of have to do a lot of scaffolding kind of behind the scenes to make it look like it's just gently floating on the landscape. And so just keeping that in mind, when you see something out in the landscape that just looks smooth and seamless, there's probably a lot of good detailing behind the scenes there. And this is what it looked like from above. And what I thought was interesting about this was we had this kind of perfect ellipse of lawn surrounded by this kind of band of meadow. And what I learned about Meadow in this project is that you really have to think about client expectations, about what it's going to look like, what it takes to establish and maintain, and kind of what their capabilities are, with their maintenance crew. And so the rules with Meadow is they'll hate you the first year, talk to you the second year, and love you the third year, because that's about how long it takes to make it really look lush like you imagine a meadow will look. There's a couple years in between where they have to be weeding and just really taking care of it before it can look like this. And also making sure that they're keeping an eye on their maintenance staff so they just don't mow it down too soon and kill everything. So when you're trying something new, there is a learning curve for yourself and for the client, and just making sure that you're always being clear about what the maintenance requirements are if you're doing something new and interesting. This was an adjacent property, Queens West 7. This was a really exciting project because it was on the top of the building, and the theme of the building was dunes. So they wanted us to make these kind of constructed planters that mimic dunes. So we stacked up styrofoam underneath, because this is all on structure, and then had the minimum amount of soil that we needed over the styrofoam. So that was kind of an interesting detail to figure out. And then we planted it with grasses and yucca and really these dune-like plant material. And what was amazing was it looked like within 6 months it looked like this. Like it had irrigation, good soil, really great sun exposure, and really great plant material. Because often you'll be asked to put a green roof on a building on the north side under an overhang with no irrigation, and oh, by the way, we don't have any weight-bearing capacity, so you can't barely use any soil. So you're like, well, that's not going to work. So this was one of those really luxurious projects where we had, weight, water, sun, all the things you need to make a really amazing place. And you can see the pine trees that we planted in the planters. If you look back here, you can see they're all in a grid. Where'd they go? Yeah, you can see they're all in a grid and they're all on columns. So when you're building on a roof, you have to think about what the structure is underneath and where you can support extra weight. And this was one of the first green roofs that I did in Battery Park City. And this was, in the early 2000s, where Battery Park City had made a rule where all of their roofs had to be covered with 70% green roof on any new building in Battery Park City. So, it really required that, whatever landscape architects were working on the project were doing green roofs. But really, there weren't that many green roofs in New York at this time. Maybe Diana Belmori had done the Solaire, but really this was one of the first ones. And it was kind of early days of, I think Hydrotech was the only company that offered the full warranty of like the full sandwich from waterproofing all the way to plants. And so that really made developers feel a little bit more comfortable with having a green roof on top of their building, which usually made people nervous. But whenever you're doing something for the first time, it's always, there's a learning curve for everybody. But this was only 4 to 6 inches of expanded shale, your basic sedum mix, drip irrigation. And it wasn't even occupied, so it was really only for the performance of the green roof. It wasn't for people to actually access. So that was interesting. But another thing to keep in mind is that when you're doing something new in landscape architecture, even just new for your city, it only takes, I'd say, 2 projects to become an expert. So I did this one and I did another one, and that made me a local expert in green roof design, which was great. So I got asked to speak at conferences. I actually went to Italy and spoke at a conference about green roofs in New York. And so just keep in mind, whenever you're doing something new, 2 projects. You're an expert. So that was pretty exciting for me as a still fairly junior to mid-level designer to kind of have that exposure to be able to speak and kind of represent the firm in that way. And this picture is tinier than all the others because this is the only one I have and it's very low resolution. But it's the only picture I have of the design that I intended. So this is the ground level of the picture that had the rooftop garden. And I had this idea. I was really into allium at the time. And I thought, oh, well, that would be really interesting to have these allium that pop up all of a sudden and they're blowing in the wind. And I don't know if you can see in the back, there's these tiny little LED lights that are on a stainless steel rod. And they also blow in the wind. So I was like, oh, there's going to be this ephemeral moment in time when the allium come up and the lights are there and everything's blowing in the wind. It's going to be amazing. So here's the moment where it came up. And getting back to client expectations, they were like a little shocked when these things popped up. And they've got all sorts of, green, messy stuff that they weren't anticipating. And then when they turned brown, which I actually kind of like the brown seed heads that end up on allium and a lot of landscape plants, but not everybody is into it. So as soon as they turned brown, they had their maintenance guys go out and just dig them all out. So you will never see this again. This only happened once. So this is my only picture of what I was intending. But I think it's just interesting that you might have things that you want to try, even on a small scale from an aesthetic standpoint, and you get it into the project and you see what happens and you see if it makes you as happy as you thought that it would. But also kind of keeping in mind the building's expectations, maybe in this case, of how neat they want the entry planting to look at all times of year. So, interesting lesson learned. This was a public park similar to our Topos here in San Francisco, the privately owned public spaces. This was in Soho in New York. It was a cut-through, so it was like a mid-block crossing. But it was kind of this long, skinny plaza. But what was great was by that time, New York had created really intense guidelines for Topos. Because it used to be that back in the day, you could just have a plaza, stick a piece of art in it, and get a bunch of extra floors on your building, and there you go. But you really weren't contributing a lot to the public realm. And so they made all these rules. You have to have this many trees per square foot, this much percentage of planting, this many benches, this 50% have to have arms and backs. And so there was a lot of rules about Topos. And so we got to create this really lush outdoor space. We even went as far as to do like a bulb planting and timing it so that you had bulbs from very, very early spring, all the way through the summer, just so you can kind of get this garden-esque feeling in the middle of the city. And what's great about working on public projects is you can go anytime and watch people use your space. So you can kind of secretly sit there, watch everybody enjoying it. And usually they're using the space in a way that you didn't anticipate, which is kind of great that you can kind of do this post-occupancy just visually of how people are using the space. So that was great. Actually, what I learned about this one was that there was an adjacent restaurant that was backing up onto the space, but it didn't open right away. And it ended up being a pretty fancy restaurant, and they didn't and I think they didn't open right away, and so people had started to hang out here at night. And so then they really didn't want to have outdoor seating because they felt like it wasn't a really desirable place for their patrons to be. But what's too bad is that if they had opened right away and there was activity and light at night, then really it would have been an unattractive place for people to hang out at night. So when you're thinking about your public spaces, you really do think about activation, because without that, if it's in kind of a dark corner and it's open 24 hours, it can become an attractive nuisance later. This was a project that I worked at Bard University. This was a new science center. One of the interesting things about working with, kind of a private landscape architecture firm was that we got to work with really interesting architects too. So this was one with Raphael Vignoli's office. It was this really kind of sleek, simple design, and so our landscape really had to match what they were doing with the architecture. So we did this custom Ipe bench all the way around, lit underneath really simply with just one giant ellipse of like a monolithic grass planting. So it was a really pretty interesting experience to work with those types of architects. And again, a tiny picture means a good story. This was at Bard. It was one of my first construction administration meetings that I went to by myself. So as a junior designer, I'm there by myself, the construction admin meeting, and at the end, the contractor says, "Oh, so we've got all these rhododendron here, and we really need you to lay them out in the field. Can you stay and do that?" And of course, I still do this now, but especially as a younger person, I was like, "Yes, I can do that." And then I'm like, what am I saying? I've never done this before, but you just go out into the field. How hard could it be? There's guys running around with wheelbarrows and rhododendron, and I'm just, across the street, like, a little to the left. No, grip them like this, kind of orchestrating the whole thing. But what I liked about it is it was a limited risk, for me to do that. If I did it, is there a wrong way to organize those rhododendron under the trees? Probably not really. But it was a really great way for me to take some ownership and have pride in the project that I was working on. So I think there's a good balance of construction administration. You don't want to send people out to the field with no idea what they're doing. But also I think it's, with a certain amount of instruction, if you have kind of the agency to kind of make determinations on the site, I think that really gives you a great feeling of pride in the project, even if you didn't design it. And the other advice that I would have was to be persistent. So in addition to the work that I was doing at the office, I was really interested in teaching. And I'd done a few lectures with the green roof topic and maybe a couple intro classes to landscape at the botanical garden, but I was really interested in teaching how studio level courses. And so what I did was I just kept talking about it to whoever was around until somebody finally said, "Oh, I know someone." And I think being persistent about the idea that you have and just talking to everyone that you can really helps. I was at an ASLA event and I was talking to a colleague, Richard Alomar, who now teaches at Rutgers. And I said, "Gosh, I really wish I could teach." And he said, "Oh, well, the head of the Columbia program is right over there, and I know him and I can introduce you." So he introduced me. I sent him my portfolio. We had lunch, and I was teaching. And so I think you just have to kind of keep saying it until you find the thing you're looking for. Because, in assuming that you've built your network of people, right, when you started your career, and then you have all these great resources to draw from. So definitely be persistent, whatever it is that you're interested in doing. And also, don't be afraid to start anywhere, even if it's the bottom. That is somewhere to start. Because I was also really interested in writing, like you mentioned. And so, where do you start? Landscape Architecture Magazine isn't just going to let me write for the first time for them. So I started where I could start. I wrote articles for the ASLA newsletter. It came out every quarter. I'd write a little article. And I took advantage of that to be able to interview designers that I really respected and who I wanted to get to know better. And I'll tell you this, that no one's going to say no when you call them and say how much you love their project and you want to write an article about it. People will make the time to have coffee with you. And so that was just, a really great way to get to know people and to hear their perspective on why they did what they did for the project, and also to get a little bit of writing in. And so even if you start at the bottom, that little bit of qualification makes you that much more qualified for the next thing. So then someone else introduced me to the editor for Topos. I was doing an internship in Germany, and that's where Topos is based. They made an introduction, we got to know each other, and I started becoming their New York correspondent. So that's how I started writing about the 9/11 Memorial and the High Line. So any new project that came up in New York, they would call me and I would write about it for Topos. And Garten+Landschaft is actually a sister publication of Topos, so I started writing for both. But then eventually, when I moved to Spain, I'll tell you more about that later, I was like, well, I'm usually the New York correspondent. Now what do I do? So, and I usually write for a European magazine about US projects. So I got in touch with Landscape Architecture magazine and said, well, I usually write for Topos about New York, but could I write for you about Spain? And so that's how I started writing for Topos, because there was a lot of, or for Landscape Architecture magazine, because there was an interesting project, the Madrid Rio Park that West 8 had just completed, and they had not covered it yet. And they didn't have anybody over there to do the interviews and things like that. So start anywhere, and you never know where it might end up. And so after that, so that was a decade of working in New York and getting involved in ASLA and doing a little bit of writing and teaching, and I felt like there was a little bit something missing in maybe my grasp of kind of larger landscape architecture theory. I had a good education, but I felt like when I was given a project, I would do a very good job within the box that I was given. But I wasn't maybe thinking bigger about what landscape architecture could do, in the world. And also if I wanted to teach eventually and have that option, I definitely needed a master's degree. So I ended up going to the Harvard Graduate School of Design for an MLA, but it was only 3 semesters since I had already had a previous landscape architecture degree. But it was a pretty wild 3 semesters. You just kind of jump right in, especially when you're starting as an MLA2, since you already have some experience. You don't do any of the introductory studios. You just kind of jump right into the option studios. So my first studio was with a group called Grossmax. It's a landscape architecture firm from Edinburgh, Scotland. And it was wildly different than anything I had ever been asked to do. I mean, I was used to being so practical. I'm like, okay, what kind of screw is that? I'm going to design all the little things. And they were like, find an image that's going to inspire you and, have that drive your whole project. And I'm like, well, but why? And why are we doing this? And they said, make a beautiful image, and it was just so perplexing to me and stressful. And I didn't even know how to start. There's no program, and so it was, it took a little while, that whole semester, for me to really shift my thinking and kind of open up my thinking from the very practical things that I had been doing to allow myself to dream a little about kind of landscapes that I hadn't yet imagined. So in Boston, there's a series of islands in the harbor, and we were doing a master plan for the islands as our studio project. And so I was always interested in geology, and so I realized that Boston was actually a series of these drumlin fields that had been drowned as the waters rose. So all the islands were actually these little hills that had just been covered up with water. And so, of course, I picked the island that had the most drumlins, which is Petix Island. And with sea level rise, I did a study showing how the island would eventually become its own series of islands over time, and how could I design it now so that it could be accessible in the future. So I ended up with a boardwalk that eventually becomes a bridge. I thought it would be interesting. There was a hill. If you put a fire tower on top of the hill and then you scattered all the seeds and let the wind kind of make the pattern of where they ended up, if you were part of the initial seed scattering, you would eventually be covered in trees when you're at the top of the fire tower. So I thought of a little kid being part of this seed throwing, and then when the child is older, to actually be up in the trees. And just the whole representational requirements were so much different than what I was used to. We kind of had to teach ourselves Rhino on the fly and all these different rendering programs. I'm sure you guys are used to that. But this is actually my favorite rendering because I was really tired. And I just said, well, forget it. I'm just going to put every trope that you possibly can put in a rendering, and I don't care. I'm going to put a balloon release. I'm going to set stuff on fire. there's going to be little kids pointing, and wildflowers. I'm just going to put every ridiculous thing in here. And then when I went for the critique, they were like, now this is really evocative. And I'm like, oh my God. I was joking, but actually the images that I created out of that studio are actually some of my favorite because they are the most evocative. They weren't practical. They were just trying to give you a feeling. And so that was a really exciting part of that experience. And I only had one summer in between semesters, since I was only there for 3 semesters. So I really had to figure out how to make the most of this one summer. So I got an internship in Munich, Germany, with a small landscape architecture firm. They were kind of barely paying me, but it was just a really good excuse to go over there. And I had applied for a Pennywhite travel fellowship to study port cities on the North Sea and how marshes related to the development of the port and the city. And so, I had some good reasons to be there. And so I was in Munich, I did the internship, but really the exciting part was kind of wandering around industrial Germany. So I'm sure you guys all know, the Duisburg Nord, Peter Latz kind of series of industrial landscape projects in Germany. So I kind of did my own personal industrial landscape tour. They call it the Ruhrgebiet. It's kind of like the old coal country of Germany. But they've taken all these amazing old kind of steel and coal plants and turned them into just these gorgeous landscape parks. And so kind of changing it from a landscape that probably made people feel bad, because it was just like in the US, it was a change of economy, a change in people's financial circumstances. There's intensive contamination related to all of these industries, but to really turn it into kind of a point of pride for the community. So it's really great for me to see those projects. And I started to call it Slaying the Dragon, because for me, like Duisburg Nord was this kind of unattainable project that I thought was amazing, and I could never do anything like that. And so to actually go see the thing that you think is beyond you, I think is a really powerful thing to do. Because standing there, here was the picture in the book, and here's me standing in the place of the picture in the book, but it's years later, so you can't quite see the same view, and it's a different time of year, but to actually be standing there like, here's the thing I idolize, and here it is in real life, it just made it that much more attainable to me. Like, this is, okay, I understand this now, it doesn't seem like it's not beyond what I could accomplish. And so I would definitely encourage all of you to go see the thing that you hold on the highest pedestal just to make it real for you. So that was a big deal for me. And also it just allowed me to explore the way that I am in a landscape and how I discover a landscape, which mostly kind of happens by yourself, really. So how do you see when you're walking around and analyzing a landscape, and what do you take away from the site? So if you're going to a new site, how do you explore it? And so, I was by myself, wandering around Germany for 3 weeks, couch surfing and getting on the train. And I didn't always have internet access. I actually had like a little paper map. I draw out, how to get from the train to my Airbnb, to my couch surfing spot. And, it was just this, adventure for me at the time. And I had never really done that by myself. So it was just kind of a personal exploration as well. More industrial glamour shots. And so after graduate school, prior to graduate school, I'd already worked in landscape architecture firms. I was registered. I'd built a lot of work. And so I was, and I had become really passionate about industrial landscapes and ecology. So where do I go from there? So I wanted to go wherever they were working on those types of projects. So I found an ecological design firm in New York that was working on a 180-acre contaminated site and wetland restoration in New Jersey. I was like, oh, perfect. Because I'd also fallen in love with the New Jersey Meadowlands. If you're familiar with the landscape, like at the beginning of the Sopranos episode where they're going through all that industrial kind of wasteland, but with a marsh, So that was kind of heaven to me. I was like, oh, great. I'm definitely going to go do that. Hang out on an industrial site in New Jersey. That's going to be great. So there's me, hanging out at an industrial site in New Jersey. And I kind of traded in my desk work for waiters and a GPS. And, this is like, 10-foot tall Phragmites, super invasive weed that was pretty much over the entire site. So you're kind of walking around. You can't really see where you are once you get into the Phragmites. So you really do need the GPS. And what we would do was we would actually design the trail system in CAD, in the computer. We'd load it into the GPS and then go walk it on the actual site and then make adjustments. Like if we're walking, we're like, oh, actually there's a tree there, I'm going to edit it in the GPS. And this view is actually a little better, so we're going to make it over here. So we would like make edits in real time using the GPS and then take that back to the office and put that back in the computer. So there's a lot of back and forth between actual site work and the computer work that we're used to doing. So this is my beautiful site. That's what it looked like originally, and this was a rendering of what it was going to look like in the future. And I actually just checked on Google Earth, and it really does it's starting to look like this now, which is really great. But it was so contaminated up here that they had to build a hydraulic barrier wall that you can kind of see so that the contamination that was in the groundwater wouldn't make it all the way to the river. And at some point, the river had been dredged, and they dumped that contaminated dredge right on the site. So there was some contamination from the industry, some from the dredge, but in cleaning the site, they were disrupting the wetlands that had formed. So that's kind of where our company came in, was to restore all the wetlands. So as a landscape architect, I was looking at the trail system. So we were looking at how do people get around the site. We were creating bird blinds and boardwalks and places for people to be. But we were also doing the planting plans and the grading plans for all the restoration work itself, which was really interesting. And also, along the theme of going where there are no landscape architects, there are really only a couple landscape architects in this firm. It was all scientists, ecologists, wetland biologists, people that specialize in birds or fish, and so people with various scientific specialties. So I'd say that one of the most interesting things about that job was just having those really productive arguments with people that think differently than you. I remember one in particular, we thought, well, wouldn't it be more efficient to just kind of grid out all the plants when you plant them? We'd have a certain mix of plants, maybe it'd be really faster for them to plant them more in an agricultural way, and the ecologists just freaked out. They're like, oh my God, no, you have to plant it in soft shapes, otherwise the animals aren't going to react to it the same way. And I was like, well, let's really look at it. If you planted it randomly but in a grid, one's going to die, this one's going to move over there, and eventually there's going to be enough attrition where the edges are going to get blurry. So it was just one of those kind of fun conversations where we both had knee-jerk reactions to the other person's opinion. But when you work next to someone every day, I think you really do start to respect what it is that they do and their point of view. And so they started to understand how designers thought, we started to understand how ecologists thought, and then by the end we were really collaborating quite well together more naturally. So I think there is something to be said with sitting next to someone for a long period of time and building that trust. Because if you don't trust each other and you don't respect the other person's opinion, you're really never going to collaborate well together. Oh, and if you're wondering what this was my graphic construction schedule. So this was the implementation of each phase, and this was how much more biodiverse it was going to get by the time we were finished. So that was kind of my way of doing a construction schedule and a biodiversity improvement diagram at the same time. I'd clearly just gotten out of grad school. Everything's a great diagram. But, and you'll probably find this in your life too, there's often things that just kind of change your plans completely or just kind of make you take a pause. So at the time, a former partner of mine decided to go to business school in Madrid. So I moved to Madrid. So I left my job, sold my car, moved to Madrid. But then the question was, what was I going to do while I was there? So I didn't have a work visa. As you know, this can be problematic sometimes. And so, what should I do while I was there? I had to earn money, and I had to keep busy. So I ended up being a guest professor at a couple different universities that had landscape architecture courses. That's when I started writing for Landscape Architecture magazine. I started my own LLC called Margins Wild in the U.S. so that I could have a U.S. corporation, so that if someone did want to do work with me, I was a U.S.-based entity, and I also taught English for cash. So it was a time of variety and exploration, but I really did enjoy it. And what it taught me, having my own firm for a little while, was that the things that I learned at Great Ecology and kind of my passion for ecology and habitat and combining science and landscape architecture was actually a really powerful thing that not everybody was doing. So I ended up working with an architect who was doing a project in Kuwait, and it was someone's kind of second home, kind of in a rural area in Kuwait that had a lot of date farms. So they had this giant grid of dates. And I thought, well, that's kind of a monoculture, that could be a lot more diverse. but this is a really dry climate. So I did a lot of research about permaculture and came upon a project in Jordan where they had used gray water and mulch to start to enrich the soil. And there was a nitrogen-fixing tree that I had heard of. I thought, okay, well, if you use gray water, mulch, have these swales, plant these nitrogen-fixing trees, you can really start to improve the soil and maybe eventually have an understory layer of citrus trees underneath the date palms to make it more diverse. And then there was also a native dune system. And so there were these trees that had, kind of shrubby trees that had these tightly branched structure that would catch the sand and make the dunes, over time. And so it was so windy that I organized these trees kind of on the wind side so that eventually they would catch the sand and kind of build their own dune system. So that was my work with that architect. I was working through some of the gray water systems that we were going to use. It was so dry that we wanted to do a subsurface gray water treatment system because otherwise all the water would just evaporate immediately. I did a competition with an architect, Sandra Herrera, that I went to graduate school with, who also lived in Madrid. This was a great project because very similar to California, they have a lot of dry creek beds. It's a Mediterranean climate, so it doesn't rain all year, dry creek bed, and then all of a sudden it's a deluge in the wintertime. And so this was a really neglected riparian corridor. People really just used it to walk their dogs. It was mostly just dirt. And whenever the rain would come, it would cause massive erosion because there was no plants, no rocks, no anything. And so what we proposed was, restoring the creek bed, kind of creating, let's see if I can see here, kind of places where the water could slow down and not erode so quickly. But also so you could actually enjoy it when it's dry and when it's wet. So we created a series of platforms that became bridges and seating, kind of throughout so you could walk across it without disrupting it. And when it's wet, you could still also use it. This is just an image of what we thought it could look like. And so also when I was in Spain, I was still thinking about, industrial sites. I still had my love of industrial sites. And I saw on LinkedIn there was a summer program for contaminated soil. Sounds exciting, in Paris. And I was like, that sounds great. But I really couldn't afford to go. But I got in touch with the organizers and said, well, this sounds like an amazing conference. Tell me more. Have you ever worked with a landscape architect before? And they were all, PhDs in soil science, so they had not. And so we did a Skype video chat, and it was awesome because I was staying in a rented apartment that had really bright colored walls and a lot of modern art behind me. And they were in a beige conference room in an engineering building. And so it was really fun to talk to them, just to kind of open their minds to what landscape architects might be interested in soil contamination science. Because I was really excited about phytoremediation, so using plants to clean contaminated soils. And they were like, oh, we never thought landscape architects would be interested in that kind of thing. And so it just kind of started this conversation. I figured it wouldn't go anywhere, But then a year later, they called me and said, oh, well, we're doing the conference again next year. Would you like to come and give a course in phytoremediation to our PhD students? And we can pay for it. And if we bring you on as a fellow, you could stay for a month. Do you want to come? And I was like, that sounds great. I was like, a month in Paris? Yes, that sounds terrible. But I had moved to California by that time, so it ended up I had to negotiate with a new employer for me to take this month off to go to Paris for this fellowship. But again, being where there are no landscape architects was a pretty fascinating thing. You're automatically the most interesting person in the room, which is great, but you're also learning things from them. So you're learning their perspective and really what they're looking for. And they brought me into a project. There was a contaminated, abandoned peach orchard east of Paris. It was called Mur à Pêche. It was like the peach walls. And so they had all these beautiful stone walls, really tightly spaced, and spaced just so that they would catch the sun at the right angle to warm the wall. And they espaliered the peaches on the walls, and so it kept them from freezing when it got cold. And so it was kind of the perfect way to grow peaches before you had refrigerated trucks that could move them around the country. But over time, they had again brought in some dredge, some contaminated dredge to put in the peach orchard. And there was a clay pan underneath the peach orchard. So in one way, it was lucky that the contamination couldn't go any further, but bad in another way that it was still there in kind of a little bathtub under the peach orchard. And so they were, one of their PhD students was doing a study on phytoremediation using lantana in the peach orchard. But it was just, tiny little kind of scientific plots. And I thought, wouldn't it be more fun if it was a phytoremediation garden? And could you actually design a garden in a way that you can do your scientific research, it's doing the cleaning that it needs to do, but you can also be a place for people. But the more I tried to design it, I was like, well, you've got to have a place for people to walk, and you've got to have a place for people to sit, and so there's going to be places where there's no plants. And so we came up with an interesting design that was a figure ground. I don't know if you can kind of squint at that and see that they're opposites. And so, maybe in one season you plant half of it, and the other season you flip the whole design and plant the other half. So that was just one idea of how you could make a phytoremediation garden that you could actually use. So I came back from Spain to the U.S. And decided I wanted to still live in a Mediterranean climate. So I moved here because it's the only Mediterranean climate in the U.S. And I worked at a couple of smaller firms before I found myself at Perkins & Will. So Perkins & Will is another large interdisciplinary firm, and they did not have a landscape architecture practice on the West Coast. So they had landscape architecture, strong groups in their Atlanta and Minneapolis offices, but nobody on the West Coast. So they brought me in to start that group, which was a really exciting opportunity because it was kind of like starting your own firm within a big firm. So you've got lots of resources, you've already got a good reputation, the other landscape groups had a good portfolio. So I started working with all the different Perkins & Will offices up and down the West Coast and building my team in San Francisco. But the first project I worked on were huge multimodal transit stations in Mecca, which was a whole nother world for me. Yeah, I know, it's pretty huge. But we were building these 3 different transit stations around Mecca to accommodate pilgrims during the Hajj. And so you had to build it for just this influx of millions of people, but then it also had to function when there weren't millions of people. So how do you make a space work for millions of people and then look comfortable when they're not there? So we had some ideas about activating parts of it with fountains, but then they could just be flat when there's too many people. But it was fascinating, the flow modeling that had to happen just for people getting onboarding the trains, offboarding the trains. The buses are coming here, people are moving there, all these giant escalators that are multi-stories. So I was traveling a lot at the time. I was going mostly to Egypt, Turkey, and Dubai because we really couldn't go to Mecca, so we would just meet our design partners in other cities in the Middle East. But it was a fascinating process, and I really learned a lot just about the process of the Hajj, all these intermodal transit stations. So it was a pretty exciting way to jump into a new job, for sure. But then, we worked on local things too, like we did a high-rise in Oakland at 17th and Webster. I think it's done now, but I might have to pretend to buy an apartment to go check it out. But we did a really interesting indoor-outdoor lobby that could be open during the day and closed down at night. There were a lot of rooftop amenities. I mean, in San Francisco, you really have to compete to have the best, amenities if you want to attract people to your building. So we had, barbecue grills and lounges. We ended up having a whole dog section with an outdoor dog wash and a dog park and a pool on the top of the roof. So it's really pretty exciting local projects as well. But one of the projects I enjoyed the most was a competition that we did for a wastewater treatment plant in San Mateo. And that kind of brought back in some more of my ecological design background and thinking about resilience and sea level rise. So we were really looking at it as a resource recovery center, because normally nobody wants a wastewater treatment plant in their backyard. But if it was an amazing amenity, and nowadays they don't have to smell. I mean, they have the technology for it not to be kind of a smelly neighbor. But how do you really open it up as much as you safely can to let people use it as a park, an educational center? We reused some of the existing structures as gardens. And we raised up all the critical infrastructure to be above 2,100 projected sea level rise. And then this was a channelized creek that we naturalized and kind of really used this whole corridor as an opportunity for floodwater during certain times of year. You can kind of get a view on the ground level here. Actually, these kind of little eye-shaped pieces, you could actually walk up to the top and look in on the operations. Instead of actually having to go inside to take a tour, you could just kind of walk up and peek in. And here was a section, kind of again with a theme in my work over time of, kind of having something that's a boardwalk, but that becomes a bridge during wetter weather. But so, all of that was happening. It was all very exciting. But what I found was it was a lot of the smaller pro bono local community projects in San Francisco that I was really excited about. And that's where I kind of spent all my extra time. So we did a drought-tolerant lawn pilot right in front of the office. So this is the front of the Perkinson Mill office, and there was a big triangle of lawn. And it's the middle of a drought. We're a sustainable design firm, and we're just standing in the front like, yeah, we can't do this. But we really didn't own the property, and so we had to make a request if we could do this experiment just on half of the lawn. And so I picked a whole bunch of drought-tolerant lawn alternatives and put them in very kind of scientific strips so we could measure which one did the best, and got the whole office involved in the planting day. And it was kind of amazing, the transformation, because they had the sod off in one day, we had the plants done the next day, so just in 2 days it looked remarkably different. So that was really fun. We even did a time-lapse video of, we put a camera up in an adjacent tree, and on the planting day we did a little time-lapse video of everybody planting, which was great. And what was funny, all the other things that we were doing, we actually got the most press for this. It was in Curbed twice, because they had to do the first article saying and the guy who wrote the article really made it a competition. 6 grasses duking it out for dominance in San Francisco. And so after a year I said, oh well, you've got to report on it again with the results. So we then came back and reported back out on the results. But it's just funny how a very just small kind of grassroots but kind of eye-catching project can really get you some press. And I would think about that too, whether you're at, if you ever start your own firm or you're working for a firm, it can be those small things like that that really get you some attention. So Perkinson Will does 1% of its work as pro bono. And so I was at a BioBlitz. Do you guys know what a BioBlitz is? It's where you use you can use an app or not an app, but I usually use an app called iNaturalist. And you go out into a landscape and you document as much biodiversity as you can in one day. Sometimes you throw a whole bunch of people at it and then get a lot of information in a short period of time. So I was at a BioBlitz at McLaren Park, and I met this teacher from the June Jordan School for Social Equity, and we were chit-chatting afterwards, and she said, oh, you're a landscape architect. Can you design a wetland? So of course I said, yes, I can do that. And she said, well, we've got this site. And we've got this asphalt lot. We're not doing anything with it. And I'm a science teacher, and my friend's a science teacher, and we would love to create a garden where we could teach the kids about science and get them outside in the garden, teach them about native habitat. So I was like, great, that sounds great. So it was kind of a perfect case for a pro bono project. It was it was a school for social equity. They really couldn't afford to hire a designer on their own. And so what we did was, since we didn't have survey information for soil or anything for the site itself, and we really couldn't afford to get a survey, there's the thing called the Significant Natural Area Resource Management Plan that the Natural Resources Group at the Parks Department has for all the natural areas in parks in San Francisco. So this is freely available online, and so every natural area, they've got mapped the soil, the vegetation, the habitat. So it's really great if you're going to a park. You could just print out the sheets that are just for that park, and you know right where all the different habitats are, and it's really kind of an interesting resource to have. So I looked it up from McLaren Park, which was, the school is just adjacent to the park. So I got a really good sense of what habitats are right next door. And so what might we likely attract at the school if we build this garden? And so we did a couple of charrettes with the students, and these are freshman and sophomore students, which we thought would be the best to work with, because once we implement the project, they'll have been there at the beginning, and if hopefully we'll finish it by the time they leave school, so they could really feel the sense of accomplishment. They even presented their ideas to the SFPUC, because we applied for a grant, a stormwater management grant. So it was a pretty cool process with the kids. But what was interesting was, we tried to explain the relationship between pollinators and certain, larval, plant hosts. So if you want to see this butterfly, that means you need to have these plants. If you want to see this bird, you need to have this. So kind of having them understand the cause and effect between critters they might want to see and what they need to plant to attract them. But what was interesting was they really also wanted to play. And I thought freshmen and sophomores, they're not really going to be interested in playgrounds. But they were like, oh, can we have swings and a slide and a clubhouse? And we're like, okay, this garden just got a lot more interesting. It's not only a science garden, but how can we integrate something playful into the garden too? So we came up with this idea of Petri Dishes. I worked with Yushi at Perkins & Will on this, and she found an artist that did these just really eye-popping Petri dish designs that we thought were a really good metaphor for the project. And so each circle in the garden is a different habitat. And so, almost like when you walk into each one, you're walking into your own little Petri dish of a different type of habitat. And what I liked about it was that really you only had to build all the paths to frame each space. And we weren't sure how much money we were going to have. So we were going to apply for this grant. That might cover part of it, but we might have to build it over time. So that would be great if each class did one a year, But at least if you had all of the paths outlined and all the circles, you could see the future of what the garden was going to be and get excited about doing the next circle. And so that gave us a way to kind of phase the project over time. Here you can kind of see an aerial of what that might be like. That's kind of our clubhouse / shade structure. You can see the kids using the wetland gardens for their science class. And so that was an exciting project. We actually got the grant. I've since left, but I did get a picture from one of the teachers that they had finally removed the asphalt. Unfortunately, there was asbestos in the asphalt, and so to dispose of the asphalt, you had to treat it like hazardous material. So it was extremely expensive just to get rid of the asphalt. So that was a hard part of the project, is that most of the money went to taking the asphalt away. But hopefully they're moving on to the next phase. But another thing that we did at Perkins & Will, they did invest a lot in research. We had these different research labs. And so I had kind of a personal question that I was asking myself was, why do parking lots have to be so ugly? I think I was in Spain and I was sitting at a cafe looking across the street, and there was some really nice parking lot. Like it had, gravel and a lot of beautiful trees. And for some reason I was just like, well, why can't we do that? And so I just kind of always had this on my mind. This is a really beautiful parking lot, if you can believe it, by Martha Schwartz. It looks like a high-end plaza. It's gorgeous. But that was just something that I had been thinking of. But when I got to Perkins & Will, they had a partnership with the Arid Lands Institute and some other researchers to look at soil permeability. And so how can, especially down in LA, how do we get more water back? They took them all out, cataloged them. The Art Commission cataloged them all into which ones need to be protected, which ones were kind of too far falling apart, which ones were good to be left and put back into the playground. But I really may have never found that playground if I wasn't looking. And it really kind of renewed my love of San Francisco, that as much as things change, I think there are still these little idiosyncratic pockets all over the city of hidden gems that you just haven't seen yet. Yeah, and then some bigger projects like the Joe DiMaggio playground in North Beach, worked on the Washington Square Park playground and renovation that's happening now. But I love Joe DiMaggio because it's such a hub. And I think really one of the benefits of working on public projects is that I think everybody feels kind of the responsibility that you're creating people's daily life experiences. When you're not at home and you're not at work, a lot of people live parts of their lives here. They take their kids here to the playground, they go to the pool, the library, the community center. That's where you see your friends. So being such an integral part of people's kind of daily life experience is something that I think is meaningful to everybody that works at Public Works. This is Fern Alley. I love it because it's kind of an Instagrammable image already. But we're redoing a lot of the alleys. This one's just off of Polk. We're doing a whole bunch in Chinatown, Market Octavia, Minna and Natoma over by the MoMA. We're reimagining the Japantown Peace Plaza, which was a big project we worked on this past year, which is really a fascinating cultural landscape. 100 people would show up to the community meetings. So we really got to get a lot of feedback from people. But one of the ones that's close to my heart right now is the Sunset Boulevard Master Plan, which kind of gets us back, and we'll end with this one, at the Find Your Own Projects category. It's not official. We didn't officially find our own project here, it came to us, but Sunset Boulevard is between Golden Gate Park and Lake Merced. It's kind of a really wide kind of double median that goes all the way down between those two parks. And during the drought, we had to turn off the water. And it was all lawn and trees. And so it all turned brown, during the drought. But after the drought, we were like, well, we don't just want to turn the water back on to the level that lawn needs. So can we redesign it to be a drought-tolerant, landscape that needs a lot less water? So that was kind of the assignment I was given. So the find your own project part comes where, my team and I looked at it and we said, well, this really looks just like a habitat corridor. You're connecting two parks with a big green, literally with a big green line. And so we started to ask ourselves, well, we don't know. What are there critters that want to get from point A to point B that are using Sunset Boulevard as a corridor? If we really made it a much more biodiverse landscape, what could we support? And so before we asked that question, I wanted to know what's there now. And so we went back to the BioBlitz, and we had a BioBlitz with about 30 people this summer, and we found all these different species. And actually, it was more biodiverse than I expected, I think, because it's a huge space. And, it's pretty well vegetated, so it was kind of interesting to see what we would find. But what I really wanted was a baseline so that we know what we've got, and then when we improve it, we know by how much we've improved it. Because using iNaturalist in the citizen science-based system, we can constantly get updated data just by people walking around with their smartphones tagging things that they see. So as we improve it, we could find out what's there. So this was just a little sampling of what we found. And this was a species distribution kind of intensity diagram. So you can see our thesis was, by Lake Merced and Golden Gate Park, is there going to be a lot more biodiversity because you're right next to a large natural open space? So this could be indicating that. It could also be indicating that we got tired by the time we got to the middle, because we started on both sides and we ended in the middle. So I'm not going to make any scientific pronouncements just yet. I think I'm going to want a little more data before I say that. But that was exciting, and I think that was something that we as a team brought to the table. That wasn't something we were asked to do. And as the head of the bureau, I felt pretty excited that was something that I could just say, I think we're going to do this. And it didn't cost us more than a couple people on a Sunday to get that information and to think a little bit more deeply about the project. So I would definitely encourage you all, when you're in your work, to kind of sometimes allow yourself to think outside the brief that you're given and to imagine kind of what else could be done with the project. So I will end on that and open it up to questions.
Thank you. That was great. Really interesting. So, well, I say we just go right to it. Does anybody want to start? Either online or here? Do you have any questions or comments or thoughts? So just talking.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. What is the difference career-wise between having a bachelor's and having a master's?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know if it's changed over time, but when I got out of Clemson, I felt like I was fully equipped to go out into the workforce and get an entry-level position. But I do know from experience and talking to other people that own firms is sometimes they won't even look at anybody that doesn't have a master's. But that's just certain principles of firms that may be just their own preference. I think sometimes it just depends on what types of graphics you're producing. Maybe because, if you're hiring at an entry-level position, nowadays, I think you expect a lot higher quality graphics than they did when I got out of school.
Yeah, I think sometimes in graduate programs, there's an expectation of a higher level of thinking, abstract thinking, and that you may not have the time and energy for at quite that same depth in a undergraduate program. But people graduate from both and get jobs all the time. Okay. Yes, online question. Sure.
This is from online. How different is it from working in the private sector to working in government?
That's a great question, and I've kind of done both, so I've had both experiences. Definitely the types of projects differ. Because in the private sector, I worked on a lot more developer-driven projects, where you're really thinking about who the consumer is, who's going to buy the condo or, things like that. Where in the public sector, I think there's a lot more thought about that everything's for the community. It's not just for the people that can afford to live in that building. It's for everybody in the whole city. So I appreciate that part of it. And also, just anecdotally, I found there's a lot less ego in the public sector. I think because if you come into it really wanting to serve, I think you automatically have a little bit, it's less about you. And at least within our own group, I found that people are much more open to critique of their projects. Like people tend to take things a little less personally. We'll pin something up on the wall and everybody will critique. And I've just noticed there's a lot less, taking things a lot less personal and a little bit less ego.
You mentioned a number of pro bono projects and competitions. How does someone make time working for a private company for projects that don't pay?
Well, the wastewater treatment plant competition was a paid competition that I did at Perkins & Will. And so we submitted, qualifications, and then they actually paid us to do the competition. Of course, you always spend a lot more money than you're paid. So Perkins & Will typically didn't do competitions if they weren't paid or invited. And I've rarely done competitions on my own just because it does take a lot of effort. Maybe I've done 2 or 3 in my whole life. But when I was in Madrid, I did have a lot of spare time when I did that one. But there have been a lot of people that have started successful firms based on one winning competition entry. So sometimes you kind of hit the jackpot with that. But if you are working at a firm, I have seen people do it, but just out of passion for design. They don't mind staying up all weekend just to kind of do a competition with their friends.
How could you approach city committees in small towns as a new designer to contribute to community enrichment?
Ooh, that's good.
Good question.
Well, just talk to people. Because it depends on the community and what that particular community's interests are. So I think sometimes we assume we know what their interests are, but often, I'm surprised by, what their actual concerns are. But the question was if they're a young designer trying to, approach a community?
As a new designer.
Okay.
To contribute to community enrichment.
Well, and I think they might be pretty open to it also, especially if you're a new designer, you're really enthusiastic, maybe you want to give some of your thoughts and ideas to the community pro bono, they might be open to that a lot.
Have you found in your experience that there's a hierarchy in the other professions when you're working together, such as people tend to veer more towards what the engineers and the architects think, and then landscape architects are like the last kind of thought that gets involved? Or
Yeah, we've probably been the redheaded stepchild for a long time, but I think in the past people didn't understand what we did as much as people do now. I think just in the general public knowledge, there's a lot more understanding of the importance of what we do when it comes to resilience and climate change and habitat, and realizing that we are kind of the experts in those things. But also we're the ones that speak all the languages. I think we speak enough engineering and enough architecture and enough community engagement to kind of be the middle person. So I think we're also very good at being the facilitator. But I think there's always a lot of education that you have to do. Even whenever I was working with a new architect, there was kind of a learning curve where they had to understand kind of what we were bringing to the table. I got people kind of trained over time when I was working with architects internally that they really had to bring us in at the very beginning. Because the fear is, if I bring you in at the beginning, it's going to be expensive. Usually I just bring you in when I've already made all the decisions at the end of DD, and then you just finish it up. But they're helping them understand that you actually need to be involved in the beginning so that you can help them make some pretty critical decisions. Like, okay, you've got a roof and you want to have a garden on it. Do you want trees? Where am I going to put them? You want weight bearing, your structural engineer needs to be at the table to make sure they're calculating that. California has a lot of stormwater management regulations. That takes square footage. And if you're building kind of lot line to lot line and there's no space left, where's that stormwater management system going to go? I actually ended up putting some on a podium, which is also heavy. So kind of helping them understand that you're actually helping them out by making these decisions early rather than waiting to the end.
We got a lot online.
Oh, good. Hi, online people.
What were the main differences and challenges that you found working in other countries compared to the U.S.?
Ooh, okay. Well, let's see. I was in Munich for an internship. So, there was really no language barrier there. Everyone's English was really great. And all the projects we were working on were international anyways. I did have a hard time getting information. Like, there's not always great survey information. Depending on what country you're working in, it can be difficult to get that kind of data. Again, when I was working in Spain, their economy wasn't great, so the projects weren't local projects. They were in Kuwait. I did try to get on the phone with a local plant vendor, though, in Kuwait, near where the project was, to talk about native plants. And there was a bit of a language barrier and like a pretty significant time change. So that was a bit different. But working on the projects in the Middle East, the transit projects in Mecca, I thought was fascinating. Because I would say I really didn't know that much about the religion and about what happens during the Hajj. And I found that working with people in different cultures, I really had a much better understanding, and I even found myself defending against other people who just weren't knowledgeable, and maybe had preconceptions about things. And so it really kind of changed the way that I looked at it.
Another one. How has being a woman in a male-dominated field impacted your career? This is someone who's a mother, and they're worried that being a mother will be a detriment to their career. What do you suggest?
It won't be a problem at all. No. Well, I'm probably a little bit spoiled because one of my early jobs was at a women-owned firm. So I've never really seen being a woman as a barrier to being at the top because my bosses were women. And I've never really felt kind of discriminated against in that way. Everybody was just as equally supportive to me moving up. And I think now, probably more so than before, being a mother and being a parent in general is a lot more respected and accounted for. As I think if people want to keep talent, they really need to think about people's life-work balance. But I know in the past, I know women who were mothers who had started their own firms, and they would never tell anyone they had kids, which is interesting. They would say, "Oh, I have an appointment. I can't do it then." They wouldn't say, "I have to pick up my kid at school." And so they would they didn't want to be thought of as different than men that were running their own firms. Like, "Oh, she's not going to work as hard. She's too busy with her kids." Like, people making assumptions about what you may or may not have time for, or how ambitious you may or may not be because you have a family. But I've definitely found working at the city to be a really welcoming environment for families. Like, we have a lot of people that have kids, and a lot of people that have families. We're pretty accommodating about schedules. So, yeah, I would definitely tell them that it shouldn't be a barrier.
In a design, how do you balance the detailed designs and the overall design?
Okay, how do you balance it? Well, I think it helps if you have knowledge of the detailed design when you're doing the overall design, which is, I think, why you become a better designer over time, because you've built the thing, or you've seen the thing built that you're drawing, so you know what goes into it. Because I've definitely seen sometimes if you don't know how to build something, you draw it in a way that doesn't make sense, when you actually get to the building of it. So there's that kind of toggling back and forth between the detailed design and the conceptual design. But at the concept level, you're also thinking about program and circulation and sun and shadow and kind of all these other things that by the time you get to detailed design, you've already made all those big decisions. But I would say to always carry the concept that's in your overall design into the details. Like, it's not a separate thing. And so if you have a partie, or kind of the thing that your project is trying to accomplish, when you're designing the bench, you should still be thinking about that partie and bring that thought all the way into the details, so that the details don't become mundane and they just reinforce the overall concept.
keep going. This is from someone from Puerto Rico. What's up? What has been the most challenging experience and the difference between working in large firms compared to smaller firms?
Well, I mean, I would definitely recommend having an experience in both. So when you do internships, I would recommend kind of getting a good cross-section. You know, try a small boutique firm, try a big international firm, just to see where you feel comfortable. Because in a small firm, I think you do get to have a lot more experience in the different parts of the process, whereas in a big firm, you kind of might not get pigeonholed, but just kind of based on whatever your talents are, be put in a particular role. I don't know, biggest challenge, was that overall or just related to the big firm, little firm?
Just overall. Because there's another question, like, what has been the biggest challenge you've faced in your career?
Okay. Well, I could kind of answer that one if that's coming up. It's just kind of to not let things get you down in a way. I mean, every job has its ups and downs. You know, you're going to love it one day and you're going to hate it the next day. And to just kind of keep going. And that knowing that, you know, the job you have may not be the job you have forever, and to not be afraid to kind of reinvent yourself as you go, because things change. I mean, what I was doing 20 years ago is not what I'm doing now. And the profession that I was in 20 years ago is so much different now than it was then. And so knowing that the world's going to keep changing, the profession's going to keep changing, and so to be ready to change with it. As I think it used to be that you would learn the skill, you got the job, you did that for the rest of your life. And that is just not the way the world works, I think, in any profession, including ours. So being ready to kind of continually be learning throughout your career.
Seems like with the pressure of climate change, too, it's rapidly.
Yeah.
What challenges have you faced to convenience the community and authorities in the design efficiency for ecological projects?
Ooh, say that again, please.
I don't understand. What challenges have you faced to convenience the community and authorities in the...
Convince the community. Okay.
Oh, convince.
Yeah.
Convince the community and authorities in the design efficiency for ecological projects.
Design efficiency. Well, I mean, convincing people to include ecological design in their project, I think, is something that can easily be done. But I think it is a challenge in communication sometimes. Especially maybe working with engineers that maybe aren't used to being flexible and trying new things with, like, stormwater management. I remember having a really interesting conversation where we were doing a master plan for a new development, but it was going to be done in these different parcels, and it really made more sense to do a district-wide stormwater management plan as opposed to making each little lot deal with its stormwater separately. And so I remember the urban designers had gotten really frustrated with the engineer because they just kept saying no to everything, and they just weren't sure if they were saying no because it was no, like it was impossible, or if they just didn't want to try something new. And so I think this is where us as being the translator between kind of design and engineering and science is really helpful, because they're like, Jen, can you please get on the phone and find out if this guy really means no or if he's just not being creative. And so we got on the phone and we kind of talked through it. And by the end, he was like, well, if I wasn't willing to try that, I wouldn't be doing my job. And I was like, there we go. You know, and so sometimes I think it's just, you know, people are just used to doing the same thing. And I think I fall into the same category sometimes too. You're just used to doing something a certain way, and getting someone to think outside their comfort zone can be difficult. But I think with everything about ecology and climate and, you know, resilience, I think there's always going to be a certain amount of education that you have to do, and just trust building to get people to be willing to take a risk with you to do something different.
How much do you think your success rests on, say, landscape architecture skills versus people skills, especially having a role at DPW where you're constantly facilitating and, you know, talking about the intersection between the engineers and the client and all that? It seems like most of being a successful landscape architect relies on the people skills of interacting with clients and stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I think especially as you move more towards a management role. I mean, I'm not designing stuff in the computer anymore. You know, I'm mostly managing people, you know, which is a big change from being a designer day to day. But I really find the people equation fascinating, and I think organizational behavior is really interesting, kind of the dynamics between people, and like you said, getting people to work in groups. But I'd say, I mean, you kind of need both. But I think, especially earlier in your career, you can probably get away with not, having very sophisticated people, negotiating skills, because mostly people are bringing information to you, you're executing the project. But as you get further along, you'll be in the meeting, negotiating with an engineer, trying to convince a developer of something. So I think it gets more important as you move along.
Many of our students have seen William White's film, The Social Life of Small Urban Places. Were the upgraded rules governing Topos in NYC a result of White's research?
Possibly. I mean, definitely, is it Project for Public Spaces that really popularized the movable chair, which really affected a lot of public spaces, like thinking about Bryant Park in New York. I mean, every lunch hour was packed, and there was always movable tables and chairs. And the ability just to kind of move it a little bit. Like some people, I mean, they would barely move it, but they would kind of, just make it theirs just a little bit, I think makes people feel really comfortable in a space. But yeah, I don't know. But I think landscape architects usually think about, I mean, everybody's seen that video, but I think landscape architects do think about sun and shadow and people watching and, vantage points. But yeah, it was definitely a very influential video.
How do you work with operations and maintenance stakeholders to make sure they're included in the project and the product is maintainable in the long term?
I mean, that's definitely a big part of what I do at Public Works, because Public Works also maintains the projects. Or if it's a rec park project, they maintain the project. And we meet with our operations group to have them review what we're doing before the design gets too far along, so they could let us know. Okay, we don't know about that, or from our experience recently, we know that this is a problem, so we don't want to do that. And it's actually really great to have that knowledge in-house to get that feedback, because, I mean, we want the projects to look great forever, And so I think we really have an advantage in that way, that we have kind of a standard paving, we have a standard palette of things that have been approved that we know we can maintain and replace, for a long time to come. So yeah, that's really helpful. I didn't always feel like I had that access on the private side. Maybe the developer doesn't even know who's going to be their operations person, and so I didn't always have the opportunity to ask that person what they would like. What I did appreciate was the 2 high-rises I was working on in Long Island City. They were both by Rockrose Development, and when I was finishing the second one, and somebody, pretty high up in the development company came out while I was doing construction administration and started asking me, okay, if you could do anything different, what would you do? Or is there anything you learned that you wouldn't do again? And at first I was like, is he trying to get me in trouble? But he knew that they were building high-rise after high-rise after high-rise in this new development, and they wanted to learn immediately from what we had just done so they didn't repeat the same mistake. And I found that if you're working with someone who's going to continue to own the building and own the property, they care a lot more about the materials and the maintainability of the project. Because if they're not going to, if they're just going to flip it, they're not really as concerned what happens 5 years from now.
There's 2 more. 2 more.
I'll need more water if there's more.
When you went back, went back for your master's, did you take off time from work or still continued working in a firm?
I took off time from work.
Solid.
And I'll be paying that off for a long time.
Could you talk a little bit more about BioBlitzes? What they
I could
are?
Talk all day. No, so I definitely highly recommend the app iNaturalist. It was developed as part of someone's Berkeley master thesis, actually, and now it's housed in the California Academy of Science, and so they're working to kind of constantly improve it. But you actually take a picture of any living thing. So you take the picture, it automatically geotags where the picture was taken, and now it has artificial intelligence to help you identify what that might be. And then all that information is kept in a publicly available database. So, so for Sunset Boulevard, we put a digital fence around Sunset Boulevard, and so at any point in time, we can pull all that data in an Excel spreadsheet, with the location, the species, the picture, all the information about the data, and we can use that. But they've actually found species that they thought were extinct, and someone took a picture. They didn't even know what they were taking a picture of, and then some scientist is looking at it and is like, that's a rare red-legged frog or something, and and it was just citizen science, just people taking pictures of stuff all over the world, and sometimes you get lucky and you find something, that you didn't even know was there. But I really also, I talked to the founder, one of the founders once, and he was actually a little worried about landscape architects using it because he was afraid we were going to use it for all our projects. Because they don't actually want to know the things you planted. They're more interested in kind of the wild habitat. So there's actually a button you could click that says captive or cultivated, just so they know that this is something that you purposefully planted, not something that you found out in the wilderness. But they were really interested in helping people learn to look at the little things that you just don't see around you every day, even in the urban environment. So when we were on Sunset Boulevard, we're pushing over logs. We found a salamander. I'm not used to picking up stuff like that, so I was really glad that they had somebody from Cal Academy who knew exactly what it was and picked it up and showed it to us. And they had they had these, what do they call them? Beet claws. There's like a white cloth that you'd put under a shrub, and then you'd beat it with a stick, and then all the little bugs would fall out onto the cloth, and you could really get a lot more things. But kids love it too. So definitely, if you want to do a bio blitz, bring kids, because they're going to really have fun finding all the critters. And birders are amazing to have with you, because it's really hard to get a photo of a bird real quick with your phone. But if they come with their big telephoto lenses, they can get some really great shots of birds. Butterflies don't always stand still when you want them to either. All right.
All right. Thank you so much
All right.
for your talk. That was great.